Hi, I'm Rebecca Casey. I'm the Director of Policy and Quality Management here at Opportunities for Positive Growth. At OPG, we have a committee called the Human Rights Committee, and today we're going to go over some of that information. So the Human Rights Committee, or HRC, is a committee that reviews all rights restrictions that are found in any plan at OPG. So some of the rights restrictions that we look at before we have to implement a plan is we look at restricting access to certain things like personal possessions. This could be sharp objects or money or the television or music. We may also look at restrictions to your right to access personal or public spaces, like a store or a movie or going to fairs or going to parks, or other activities like shopping, going out to eat, going to the movies. You may also see people have their access restricted to certain friends or family members. And you may also see some of the restrictions being about the access to community services. We also see some of the restrictions about restricting movement, and that can happen if you have one-to-one staff. It can also happen if somebody has a brace or a helmet or a splint that's being used for behavioral control. There are also times where you may review plans that have therapeutic holds or restraints. And there are also some plans where there were bed rails, mitts, or gate belts being used, and also some plans where you may see the use of alarms on windows or doors. Another area that's a restriction to people's rights is when they are on a psychotropic medication. Psychotropic medications are prescribed for mental health symptoms and the reduction of those, but that also can be viewed as a restriction of rights and has to be approved by the HRC. Any of these restrictions have to be approved prior to being implemented by the HRC, or it will not be implemented. So what are some basic human rights? So some of them are the right to equality under the law, the right to security, the right to have your religious beliefs, the right to privacy. Every person has the right to make decisions in their life, and every person has the right to be free from inhumane treatment. So as you can see on the list of the basic human rights, I only went over a couple, and there are several. And even the rights that we list here today is not an all-inclusive list. So when you see the next couple of slides about rights, there are other rights that aren't listed. If you have any questions about what rights are given to people, please ask the HRC facilitator. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a guiding principle that is used within this field and within a lot of fields about the rights that all people have. So with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's an extensive list, very interesting videos out there if you want any more information about it. But really, this is focused on your right to equality, your right to be free from discrimination, to life and liberty and personal security. It's where people have the right to have a trial by jury. It's where people have the right to get married. So with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that's constantly being updated. And as more rights come to people, that's being updated, and we keep on top of that. So your job in the HRC is to protect all of these rights and to make sure that if these rights are being restricted, there is a huge health and safety issue. That's the reason for the restriction. So what are rights versus restrictions? So on the slide, it says that rights are things like the right to own property. The restriction to that would be your restriction to personal property like sharps or computers or TVs, and that they go hand in hand. So if there's a right, you may also have a restriction to that right for certain reasons, like the right to participate in the cultural life of the community. Some people have a mobility restriction where they're not to be in a park when children are present. Maybe they aren't allowed to be at a fair during certain times. And those restrictions you would review. So even though people do have the right to participate in community life, your job is to view that restriction and see if it's a fair restriction. The right to rest and leisure. In the HRC, you're going to see a lot of terms like required relaxation or response cost, and we're going to describe some of those terms in the next couple of slides. But you may require that somebody do required relaxation if they have an anxiety disorder and may need to calm down during a certain moment. People have the right to marriage and family, and they have the right to have friends. But sometimes some of the people we support may have a restriction to the mail that they send, to the visitors who come or the times that the visitors come in their home, and to who they may call. Another area is that people have the right to refuse their medication. This is always the case. Even if people are given a psychotropic medication for a mental health diagnosis, they still have the right to refuse that medication. So some of the key terms about restrictions that you are going to hear in the HRC are a lot of really industry specific terms. And if you ever see one on an agenda and need more information about it, please do not hesitate to ask the HRC facilitator for that definition. So sometimes you'll see things that say exclusionary timeout. And when you see that, that means that somebody is being placed into an area where they can freely exit to take just a break and have a timeout from the situation. You might also see that term mobility restriction, and that really is just restricting that person's right to move around the way that they want to. Modified clothing is another restriction that you may see, and sometimes some people need different modified clothing for different reasons. So somebody may be self-injurious and try to scratch themselves, and they may end up wearing mitts at certain times because of that. Response cost is another area that you're going to hear quite a bit, and it's if somebody engages in an unwanted behavior, there may be a response cost for that behavior. So maybe somebody becomes aggressive, and when they become aggressive when you're out in the community, the response cost is that they have to leave immediately. So you'll look at that, you'll look at the severity of the issue that has occurred, and you'll see if that's a fair restriction for the health and safety issue apparent for a person. So again, if you look through those lists, you may not understand every term, but please feel free to reach out to that HRC facilitator. One of the very important areas with the HRC is that you may hear some restrictions that could possibly be prohibited restrictions to rights. We have an auditing function before any of these plans get on the HRC, but sometimes it does happen where you're listening to a plan and there are prohibited restrictions. So we're just going to go over a couple of those so you're also aware of what is prohibited within our field and what no staff or parent is allowed to do with the person that they're supporting. So obviously any form of abuse, neglect, exploitation, or mistreatment is prohibited. So that includes any physical, sexual, emotional, or verbal abuse. That includes any neglect of necessary support or services. And that also includes any form of exploitation, including those of resources, of finances, of a person's labor or work, and any sexual exploitation. We also will go over some of the areas of aversive techniques in the next slide to talk about those as prohibited interventions. We also will look at how there's restrictions to people's basic human necessities like food or water or shelter or medication, and those can never be restricted even if they're listed in a plan that is prohibited. Any use of mechanical or floor restraints is also prohibited and cannot be used. So floor restraints can be when people are prone or face down, or if they're just taken down to the floor during a restraint. OPG does not allow those restraints to occur. Mechanical restraints are when somebody is actually tying you or restraining you with another object. Denying a person their personal human liberties or freedoms, all of the ones that were listed in the basic human rights or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is also prohibited. So the state of Indiana uses a term called aversive techniques. And what that means are techniques that cannot be used, that are prohibited, and really do not have any benefit for behavioral issues. So with that, any form of aversive techniques are prohibited, like contingent exercise, which is forced physical exercise of a person. So we always think of drop and give me 20 as an example of that, forced physical exercise. Contingent noxious stimuli is another one, and that's when somebody might have an unpleasant sensory agent introduced to them to deter an unwanted behavior. So a good example of that is somebody who may get mad at someone for cursing, and so they put hot sauce in their mouth. That's completely prohibited by any person, parents, guardians, family members, or staff. Corporal punishment is the infliction of physical pain and is definitely one of those areas. That includes hitting and pinching, but that can also include electric shock, and that's prohibited. Negative practice is an area that has a definition of a required practice of an unwanted behavior for an extended period of time. So I always think about the example of somebody catching their child or their teenager smoking a cigarette and saying now you have to smoke the whole pack. That is not an effective means at behavioral modification and something that is completely prohibited. Overcorrection is another area, which is basically nagging and overcorrecting a person when they are engaging in a target behavior. Seclusion is when somebody is involuntarily placed into an area and there is no exit available to them. And then visual or facial screening is another area too. So if in a plan you ever saw somebody have their eyes covered, if something inappropriate comes on the TV, that is something that is prohibited by the state of Indiana. The Human Rights Committee has several guidelines that you'll be following as a member. One of those is that you'll be reviewing some of our program policies and procedures occasionally and providing deliberation and input into those policies. Another area is that you are going to look at any type of situations that's restricting a person's right in a plan. So you'll review all of those restrictive interventions, including those that could be used in emergency situations. You'll also review any medications that are being used to treat a mental health diagnosis. And then you're going to review plans at least annually for each person who has a restriction. So we hear a lot of plans at OPG. Were over 700 plans heard last year. So over the time that you are hearing, you're affecting the lives of almost 700 people, which is a pretty big responsibility for any committee member. So the other thing too is that we maintain the minutes and we maintain all the information about your deliberation so that we can look back and really see if this is an appropriate restriction for a person. So your responsibility as an HRC member is to ensure that people have full access to their rights as citizens and making sure that that full access is only restricted when somebody has a severe health and safety issue. You should never feel like when you're sitting in your Human Rights Committee meeting that you're just rubber stamp approving every single plan. This should be something where you ask the hard questions, where you ask for more information, and you should never be afraid to just ask for more information or decide not to hear a plan that day because you do not feel comfortable with it. You monitor and review the authorization of the use of behavioral modification interventions. So that is an area where with those restrictions, you're going to be reviewing that. You also look at limitations on mobility, you look at limitations on personal possessions, on access to different areas. But your main goal is that you're going to make recommendations to improve the degree to which someone's human and civil rights are promoted. So we want to make sure that we are always promoting those, and even if there is a restriction in place, that we know there's a plan to reduce or remove that restriction in the future. One area that's extremely important as well as an HRC member is that you hear a lot of very personal information about the people that OPG supports. We take away a lot of the identifying information like the person's first and last name, what region they may be in, who their doctors are, so that it eliminates a chance of maybe you recognizing someone. But sometimes people do recognize someone based off the description of the behavioral issues or their age. So anything that you hear within the HRC, you must keep confidential. You are not allowed to tell that to anybody outside of the Human Rights Committee. This is all about keeping a confidential approach to the information you hear and ensuring that we're protecting the rights of people to maintain their confidential information. If you ever have any questions about that too, you can talk to your HRC facilitator who can really go into a little bit more detail, and then you won't feel like you're breaking confidentiality. We also have to make a reasonable effort to make sure that we only use and disclose just enough of the information that will help you make a decision. So there are a lot of ways that we don't provide some of that information to you. And you may ask for some more specific questions like who a doctor is, and that might not be answered because we want to protect the confidentiality of the person. Another area that's really important for the HRC to know is that we always ensure that somebody has given their informed consent on the plan prior to the Human Rights Committee hearing it. So a guardian or the person supported has actually already reviewed the plan and has already consented to the interventions prior to it coming to you in a committee meeting. So within the HRC area, if you take a look at the HRC review example, you can see that this is exactly how the agenda will look. It will tell you the person's first name, the date of the document, what the document is, a person's diagnoses, their age, It's going to also tell you if the person has a guardian or a power of attorney, and it's going to tell you their target behaviors. So the target behaviors have to be linked to these restrictions. So if somebody has aggression and they have a restriction of an exclusionary timeout, that's going to be a link that's in there. So you can see within this example that there was an addition of a restriction of personal property. And this was because Sam displayed aggression towards others in August 2017 after watching a wrestling video. After that, he started trying to imitate the wrestling moves and began trying to hit other people. So now the restriction in place that is being suggested is that we restrict the access to those wrestling videos. So when this was reviewed by the Human Rights Committee initially, they got a lot of information. They get a whole description and a descriptive paragraph that you can take a look at where it's why the restriction is in place. The Human Rights Committee, when they heard it, only gave a temporary approval. And the reason that they gave that was because they needed a couple of questions answered. One of the areas that they noticed is that Sam likes to also watch football, but he doesn't emulate that behavior. So we wanted to know exactly why that was. So the HRC asked, how is football any different for him than wrestling? What qualifies it as late when he watches it late at night? Could his schedule be changed to help him watch the sporting events, but also maybe focus on reducing the chance of the aggression occurring? And then could wrestling be on demand so that he could watch it during the day and not worry about lateness too, which was also causing an issue? So we asked the consultant to respond to that for the HRC. So you are always free to ask more clarifying questions that we will ask a consultant and bring it back to our behavior specialist. So the consultant said Sam thinks that wrestling is real, which is different than the way that he may view football, because he thinks wrestling is just something that you may do. He also will show that aggression during pro wrestling. When he's watching football, he does not show that aggression. He'll stay up all night unless he's directed not to, which is another part of that restriction and why lateness was important. And once in bed, sometimes he'll continue watching or listening to the radio and not fall asleep. And this can affect his behaviors of aggression or decision-making challenges or social skill challenges the next day. And then Sam also is only able to buy on-demand wrestling. He's not able to have it available to him at all times, like through a cable box. So with that, they'll give you answers, and then the HRC goes ahead and deliberates on whether they feel like that's an appropriate restriction. It's okay to ask several more questions if you do not feel like your questions are answered. A couple more things that you need to know as an HRC member is that before voting, you may want to know a couple more things about somebody like Sam. Like, what is his living situation? Does he live with housemates or his family? What about his guardianship status? Does he have a guardian? Is he his own decision maker? Does he have a power of attorney? Is he a minor? Another thing that you might want to know is what exactly is Sam's level of understanding. And sometimes it could say that they have a mild intellectual disability. Sometimes there's information about their IQ scores, but that's a really important area to ask about because we want to know if the person actually understands what the intervention is trying to achieve. And then how often do target behaviors occur related to that restriction? We want to know that. So you might ask about the frequency of aggression to ensure that we're not just putting a restriction in place. So the last thing that I would like you to remember as a Human Rights Committee member is that the HRC is charged with this awesome responsibility. You're there to protect the due process rights of people who receive services and supports. This committee must be held accountable to understand due process and to question every situation in which a person's rights are restricted for any reason. That's from our accreditation agency, and it's something that OPG really takes seriously. We don't want to restrict anyone's rights without going through the proper due process requirements that are there. And you're the people who get to do that. So if you have any further questions about the Human Rights Committee, please feel free to ask the HRC facilitator, and please go ahead and answer the brief questions associated with this video. Thank you.